So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself in a minute, but my students, I took the questions that Martha passed on to me. I gave them to my students, and they did a really phenomenal job researching those questions and putting together a really comprehensive presentation. They are also working on a report, a written report, that our current plan is to give that to Noah at the end of the semester. There's a version of it that exists right now, but our thinking was that after the presentation today, there may be more questions or other things that they're going to be looking into, and it would make the most sense to hand over a complete version of it rather than a memo now and then a memo later on. So without further ado, are you guys ready to get started? I'm going to mute myself and I'm going to let Joey, Wendy, Alyssa, and Shannon take it away.
Okay, I'll be sharing the screen. I think I'm able to do it. Please just let me know if you can see it.
Good.
Okay, so hi everybody. Thank you so much for having us today. We're going to talk to you a little bit about the TANF program and how it intersects with affordable housing in Tennessee and the COVID-19 crisis. So just to begin, we'll introduce ourselves again. I'm Joey Kaminsky. I'm a third year at Vanderbilt Law School.
My name is Shannon Charlton. Sorry, Lisa. My name is Shannon Charlton, and I'm a 3L at Vanderbilt.
My name is Olisa UK, and I am a 3L as well.
I'm Wendy Barcelona. I'm also a third year.
Slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so just to give you a brief overview of what we're going to cover today, we kind of broke our presentation out into 3 parts. We'll start by just giving you guys a brief overview of what the TANF program is at both the federal and the state level. And then we'll move on to addressing those questions that you sent to the clinic in a memo. And then third, in line with that, we'll make a few recommendations regarding how you can advocate for a better TANF program.
I will be starting with a brief introduction to TANF. So in a nutshell, TANF stands for Temporary Assistance for Needy Families and is a federal program administered by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which I will refer to as HHS. And under TANF, HHS distributes annual block grants, contingency funds, such as emergency funds and other specialized grants to states so that each state may provide temporary cash assistance to needy families. So while states enjoy broad discretion to allocate TANF funds, they must follow some federal requirements. So what is required of each state? First, each state must use TANF funds to accomplish the purposes of the program. First, assisting needy families so that children can be cared for in their own homes. Second, reducing the dependency of needy parents by promoting job preparation, work, and marriage. Third, preventing out-of-wedlock pregnancies. And fourth, encouraging the formation and maintenance of 2-parent families. Next, the federal government requires states to contribute their own funds. These funds are referred to as the Maintenance of Effort funds, and this requirement, also I will refer to it as MO, ensures that states and the federal government share the program's operating costs. HHS decides how much each state must contribute annually using a formula based on each state's 1994 welfare budget. Failure to meet this requirement can result in a block grant reduction the following year. Next, I will discuss the work participation standards. So to receive TANF grants, states must design their TANF programs to comply with federal work requirements. To comply with these work requirements, states' programs must first evaluate family skills, work experience, and employability. Second, involve families receiving TANF benefits in employment within 24 months. Third, penalize benefit recipients that refuse to comply with work requirements without good cause. And fourth, ensure that a certain percentage of TANF recipients are employed. And also the all family and two-parent participation standards are minimum participation percentages that must be met. And if a state's TANF program fails to comply with federal obligations, that state may receive reduced TANF grants.
Next, we'll answer some of the specific questions that we were asked. One of them was how has designated or designed its TANF program, TANF. Tennessee's Department of Human Services disperses TANF funds through a few different programs. We'll talk about them in more detail in the upcoming slides, but here's just a brief introduction. The main ones are Families First, which distributes cash assistance through EBT cards and supports unemployment-related services like childcare and transportation. Next, there's the 2Gen grant program, through which DHS distributes block grants to nonprofit applicants. And finally, there's the emergency cash assistance programs, which provide cash payments to families facing emergency crises, most noticeably the COVID-19 crisis. Elisa will explain a little bit more about Families First.
So Families First is Tennessee's TANF program. It comprises of either cash assistance or non-cash assistance programs. Cash assistance can be transportation, childcare, educational supports, and the non-cash assistance can also be job training, employment and activities, or anything to help transition families into the workforce. So here's a brief overview of the people that are eligible for the funds. I'm not going to get into super detail with that, but just as you can see, as an example for Families First, you have to meet specific requirements in order to be eligible. You have to have a child, you have to be underemployed or unemployed, and a multitude of other things were we described in our memo. So how many families receive funds? So as of December 2020, which is the most latest statistical information that we have, there are 15,244 assistance units, which is basically just families. Of those families, there are about 31,000 individuals on them, and it's also broken down under adults and children. So as you can see, there are far more children in Families First than there are adults. And here, this is also for December 2020. This gives you an idea of how many working adults are in each family. So right now, about 740 working adults are in the TANF program. This number has obviously decreased since the pandemic has started. In March, it was about 1,100 working adults in each family. And then as you can see, the average monthly wage for those employed participants is about $888. And the average monthly benefit for participating families is about $244. So the average monthly wage for the employed people have also decreased since the pandemic started. It was about $950 in March. So it's decreased about $70, $80.
I'll explain a little bit about 2Gen grants now. So 2Gen stands for 2 generations, which describes Tennessee's whole family approach to funding TANF programs. The aim is to provide services and opportunities for both parents and children to succeed, thus 2 generations. It's based on this philosophy that Tennessee disperses grant money to nonprofits that meet at least one of the TANF federal program goals. These grants were meant to be funded purely by TANF money, but in reality, only about a third have been funded through federal grant money, and about 2/3 of the programs have been funded out of state funds. I'll tell you a little bit more about emergency cash assistance. So this past year, Tennessee has paid out about $14 million to essential workers for childcare, and this has been in the form of certificates that are redeemed at approved childcare facilities. They've also provided childcare agencies directly with about $24 million in emergency grant relief. They also funded free meal programs for families over the summer, and in terms of direct cash payments, They paid out about $300,000 in response to last year's tornadoes. And we don't have exact numbers for how much TANF money has been given out in cash assistance in response to COVID-19. But we do know there's been about 80,000 applicants for that money. And if they qualified, they received payments based on their household size.
So you also asked us a little bit about tracking TANF spending in Tennessee. And you asked us if there's a public way to track how the state government spends those funds. And the brief answer is, unfortunately, there isn't. Next slide, please. So according to the Comptroller's office, it's really challenging to track exactly how the state government disperses these funds because the state budget and TANF budgeting use different categories to account for their spending. So it sort of gets spread throughout the state budget in a way that's very hard to pin down. And so the Comptroller's office has recently been looking into this problem. They released this report saying that it is a problem, but it's unclear what the status of their project on tracking TANF spending is at the moment. And so we will absolutely circle back to this point when we get to our policy recommendations at the end. And you also asked us specifically how much money Tennessee contributes per year. So we talked a little bit about the maintenance of effort requirement at the beginning of the presentation, and this differs per year in Tennessee. On the right, we have this chart that shows what the state funding categories are, and that first column shows what state maintenance of effort requirements apply to Tennessee. So from 2011 through 2016, Tennessee was required to spend at least $110 million. And then 2017 through 2019, it was reduced to 88 million. And that's because in those first couple of years, Tennessee was receiving these extra federal contingency funds to help assuage unemployment and such in the local economy. But the major takeaway from this slide is that Tennessee has consistently spent above their maintenance of effort requirement. So they spend more state funds than they have to. And there is a simple explanation for this, and it's that the state actually has an incentive to spend more than it has to because they're able to tag lots of expenditures that happen from day to day in the state government as maintenance of effort. So it's very easy for them to meet this requirement. And if they go above and beyond the requirement, they get sort of credits for other programs that allows them to stay in the good graces of the federal government, basically. And so in this light, you may have heard about the TANF reserve in the news recently. And what this represents is basically all that accrued money that Tennessee has not spent from the federal government. So when they spend above their required maintenance of effort, they end up not spending these federal dollars. And so they just build up year after year. And Tennessee currently has a $732 million balance of commitments from the federal government. And this is the highest balance in the country. And so what this represents are these federal commitments to give Tennessee money to spend on its TANF program. But just to make clear, it's not a cash balance sitting in a Tennessee bank account. It's simply a commitment by the federal government to pay Tennessee if it uses funds for TANF purposes, basically.
I'll tell you a little bit about how Tennessee has been spending their federal money. So these numbers are from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Service reports, which shows how Tennessee has been spending TANF funds separated into categories. From the descriptions of the categories, we can see that the majority of the funds have been spent on basic assistance, which would be direct cash to families, and work, education, and training activities. These two categories describe what Families First is primarily responsible for administering. So while we can't be sure based on budget reports, it's likely that Families First has been administering most of these funds. You can also see from the numbers that Tennessee's spending of TANF funds has slowly been dropping off through the years.
And And just to give a little bit more context to the numbers in Wendy's previous slide, we made a slide about Tennessee compared to Georgia because it's kind of similarly situated, also politically similarly situated, to give you an idea of how Tennessee spends its funds. And Tennessee has a population about 6.8 million. Georgia has a population about 3.9 million. But as you can see, Georgia is consistently spending a lot more money in their TANF program than Tennessee is. Georgia's eligibility, as I spoke about earlier in the presentation, for cash and non-cash assistance is generally the same as Tennessee. There are some slight differences, like a lifetime limit that cash assistance can only be given out for up to 48 months, but generally all the same. The most important part to take away from this slide, though, is as you can see, though Tennessee has a smaller population, it consistently is spending a lot less of its TANF funds than Georgia, who has been consistently spending about 300,000 or 300 million funds every year. So what have states specifically done for housing? So other states have had housing cash assistance initiatives, as Tennessee has. There are 8 states who have provided temporary payments only to families already receiving TANF assistance. So this would include people who are already enrolled in the program. There are about 4 states, Delaware, Virginia, Washington, and West Virginia, who are providing temporary payments to families not already receiving TANF assistance. However, they do meet those eligibility requirements that each state, it's a little bit different each one, but each state requires. And Tennessee is one of 2 states. So Tennessee and Pennsylvania provided temporary payments to families regardless of whether they were already enrolled in TANF. So it was a separate emergency cash assistance program. They made their own requirements within that program. And then if you met and were eligible for it, you were able to receive cash assistance. So in Tennessee, I think it was about $500 over 2 months for people who got cash assistance. So there are other states who have done specific housing cash assistance initiatives. So Montana, Massachusetts, New York, and Ohio were able to provide new rent, utility, security deposit, rapid rehousing, or homelessness prevention assistance to families in need using the TANF non-recurrent short-term benefit. Maine was one state that increased the TANF food benefit, so you were able to receive more money for food rather than just for housing. So here I'm going to dive in a little bit more onto what each state that provided housing in their initiatives. So Montana was able to do an emergency rent and security deposit assistance for TANF eligible families in need. So this would be regardless of whether they were already receiving TANF cash assistance before the pandemic. They ran this program until recently. It ended in on January 31st, sorry. Massachusetts was able to secure emergency housing assistance for eligible families at risk of homelessness. They were able to define what at risk of homelessness was, but basically if families had lost half of their income or their job during the pandemic, that was an easy way to qualify for at risk of homelessness, and you were able to get cash assistance. In New York, they were able to pass cash assistance for emergency cash grants that was available for rent, utility, security deposit, or a moving expense for residents facing evictions or shutoffs of their utilities, and that was all funded by TANF. And then Ohio did something a little broader. They dedicated $16 million of their TANF funds to the Coalition of Homelessness and Housing. And through that housing coalition, they were able to ensure that homeless shelters were able to operate safely and to assist homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing services during the pandemic. So now we're going to give you a couple of policy recommendations based on the information given in the presentation.
So first we'll talk a little bit about the federal level because you asked what are some things you guys could focus on at the federal level. But I wanted to begin with a caveat that our recommendation is really to focus on Tennessee specific issues because TANF is just such a state-centric program, but that doesn't mean that there aren't issues at the federal level. So just to cover a couple of them briefly, first, a very common criticism of the TANF program at the federal level is that TANF grants are basically attached to numbers calculated in 1994. So these grants stay the same every single year in terms of cash value, but the benefits that those grants are able to provide year over year erode because of inflation. So one target could be advocating for inflation adjusted grants year over year. Secondly, a common criticism of TANF is the fact that each state can set their own standards for penalizing families who don't meet that state's TANF requirements. For example, in Tennessee, if a family receiving cash assistance no longer meets some of the requirements, they fall off a work participation plan for one reason or another, they may be kicked off the TANF rolls, even if that family is still really in need of cash assistance. So you could advocate for a uniform federal standard that eliminates some of those differences between states for kicking people off of the TANF rolls. And then third, this is very specific to the issue that we see in Tennessee, is prohibiting states from amassing large TANF reserves, something like a use it or lose it policy, so that states have incentives to spend their cash grants year over year instead of hoarding them. And then we'll turn a little bit to what you can focus on in Tennessee. So we wanted to begin by letting you know that there is no legislative approval required to spend the TANF reserve. And we'll come back to this point at the end because there's been a lot of buzz in the news recently about the legislature meeting to discuss what to do with the TANF reserve because all of the publicity about it has been certainly an embarrassment for Tennessee. So even if the legislator has some preconceived notions of how they'd like to spend the TANF reserve, those preferences don't necessarily preclude you from advocating for different ways to spend that money.
We'd also like to bring to your attention the fact that DHS has a new commissioner. So Commissioner Clarence H. Carter was appointed last month and will oversee the state's TANF spending. He's the former director of the Office of Family Assistance at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services under the Trump administration, and he oversaw the TANF program for the federal government. He might be someone to consider speaking to since he ran the entire federal program. He might have a better idea of what Tennessee could be spending the money on. And in the past, the former Commissioner Daniel Barnes and other state legislative members have talked quite a bit about 2-gen grants and wanting to disperse TANF money through nonprofit organizations, but it's unclear if the new commissioner will also have that preference.
One way that Tennessee can improve its TANF program is by targeted emergency rental assistance. In recognition of the hardships endured by families as a result of March 2020 tornado and the COVID-19 pandemic, Tennessee launched an emergency cash assistance program through TANF. And this program provides valuable precedent that you may use to persuade the governor or the legislature to establish a targeted cash assistance program for housing. A temporary infusion of cash targeted at rental assistance can help to avoid an eviction cliff that low-income renters may face even after the pandemic ends. And this short-term support could help low-income families remain current on rent through the end of the pandemic. And those families will be able to take care of their basic needs and come out of the pandemic well-positioned to seek employment. So this proposal directly promotes the purposes of TANF. It fosters self-sufficiency in workforce development, and additionally, the proposal is narrowly tailored. So the cash infusion will support essential needs for the most vulnerable families just to get through the current crisis.
And circling back to this issue with the TANF reserve being heavily publicized in the news and having Tennessee's reserve be so much larger than other states, there's been a lot of talk about better governance around the TANF program, and we think this would be a really good use of your time for advocacy, because I think there's really a lot of appetite in the state government for better oversight over this program. So one potential program is to establish a governance committee for TANF, and this committee could consist of volunteers or interested legislators, technicians that know about affordable housing issues or federal grants in general, really anybody with an interest in improving the TANF program, and they could meet periodically, question the Tennessee Department of Human Services on how they budget for and spend TANF dollars, and issue public reports on this to try and hold Tennessee TANF expenditures more accountable generally. And just to sum all of these policy proposals up, we thought it might be helpful to point out where we at least think your advocacy might be best received. So first, we mentioned that really targeting your efforts at the state rather than the federal level would be beneficial, because that's really who decides what to do with this money. And then at the state level, we mentioned that the legislature is well aware of the fact that Tennessee has a disproportionately large TANF reserve, and they've been meeting in February and January of 2021 to discuss what to do with this. So it's clear that they have some ideas and some preferences, and those so far appear to be to distribute this funding as block grants to local community organizations, rather than establishing things like pots of money for emergency cash or rental assistance. But as we mentioned, because those legislatures don't actually need to approve the expenditures under TANF, that shouldn't preclude you from advocating for cash assistance or rental assistance if that's what you want to do, because as we said before, we also think that could be very beneficial. And then secondly, we think advocating for improved governance would be very well received, given the fact that this has just been so highly publicized. Okay. And that's all we have for you. Do you have any questions for us?
Yes.
Who said yes?
Paulette, you're muted.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Oh,
Okay. Thank you very, very much for all of your hard work and for
You're muted.
that will lead to some action. I was very concerned about the MO, the maintenance of effort requirement, and help me understand, because I may have it all wrong. It sounded as if one of the reasons that Tennessee has a big proportion of their money spent is because they can pretty much classify a lot of things as maintenance of effort. And that seems to me to be very, very misleading and a potential slippery slope, because when you send the message that we're spending more than we have to, without also saying that we're doing a sleight of hand with the numbers, is kind of misleading. So what do you, help me understand if I'm correct, and then what are some steps we could take to remedy that?
Yes, first, we share your concern. That was one of the major findings in the comptroller's report that was released recently. And really, the best way to get around that or to deal with this issue is better public governance for the TANF program, because unfortunately, this classification issue where there are a lot of things that could qualify as maintenance of effort is not a problem that's unique to Tennessee. It's sort of a creature of the TANF program itself. So there have been some studies that have shown that lots of states classify things as maintenance of effort to spend more than their actual requirement is, so that they can get credit for things like work requirements, like we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. So it's really, it's something that is endemic to the entire program across the country. And the thing other states have done differently than Tennessee is really just to spend more federal dollars, even if they are classifying things left and right as maintenance of effort. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it did. And it sounds like that we just have to focus attention on it, and it might better fit into whatever responses we come up with regard to governance. I have some more, but I'll let other people go and come back to me.
I actually just wanted to follow up on something Joey said. So the majority or the largest category that state MOE funds have been categorized as has been pre-kindergarten and Head Start. So those programs that we're not sure what they're actually like putting as MOE programs, it's like more than half of state MOE money has actually been for pre-kindergarten and Head Start programs.
Thank you.
I think Susie had her hand up first, I think.
Thank you. Is there any understanding why the state of Tennessee has such an enormous balance from the federal government? I mean, obviously it hadn't been spending much on needy families, but it's a huge difference, as I recall, from all the other states.
I think one quick and slightly cynical answer is political preferences. Honestly, these are just the political preferences of the state government.
Yeah, I was going to follow up with Joey saying that, you know, especially when you see who's actually eligible for these TANF funds, I feel like colloquially people have been talking about TANF as if it's a rainy day fund. You can just, dip in. It's more of like a bank account, but really it's a very narrow eligibility requirement. And because they are not spending as much money as they should be, and they're just hoarding all of it, it really just, I think it's just a misunderstanding of what the funds are actually supposed to be doing and who they're supposed to be helping.
And that's something that a governance or somebody who held the program more accountable would help to fix, hopefully, I guess. Thank you.
I think Elaine had her hand up next.
Yeah, I have two things. One regarding Susie's is that one of the answers to that question is to look at Georgia. I don't know what their balance is, but they're spending $300 million a year for the last 10 years, and ours has been painfully short of that. So it's just we haven't tapped on that reserve, I guess. It's really a kind of an IOU from the government.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So Georgia has a more robust TANF program in general. So as I spoke about earlier, Families First is Tennessee's program, and it has, programs within that, but I think it's only 2, 3, Wendy, correct me if I'm wrong, but Georgia just has more of a robust program. So they have things for foster care, they have things for needy families, cash assistance. It's just, they have more programs, and as they spend their money, they're getting reimbursed. So they're making the right decision in spending the money, getting reimbursed by the federal government, and keeping all of those programs alive and well year to year.
Kay was next, but I haven't.
I didn't get my second quick question. It's real quick. I want to know how worried we should be about this MOE, because in my financial mind, I think what percentage is that of the total distribution of the funds? Because if we're looking at something like G&A for a not-for-profit, it might be a small 10%, 5%. What is it? Do we know? The MOE is a percent of our outflow.
Are you asking as a percentage of the total state budget, or as state spending as a percentage of total TANF spending year over year?
Oh, I thought it was a number that referred just to the TANF number.
Oh, yeah, I don't have the exact percentage offhand. We can put that in our memo for you when we follow up. But the upshot is that TANF spending in Tennessee year over year is mostly state dollars.
I have some numbers on a chart next to me. So for 2019, state money or state spending for TANF related programs was 114 million, as opposed to 73 million for federal funds. 2018 is an anomaly. It's kind of weird. So I'll just tell you about 2017. State funds were 116 million and federal funds were 66 million. And the ratio has been pretty much the same.
I'm done. Thanks.
I think Kay and then Jerry and then Susie. Is that the order the hands went up in, I think?
Thanks. Two questions. The first one has to do with, in my research, some criticism of the very narrow, tight eligibility requirements, which points to many people just don't participate that might participate and who could be eligible. I don't know how Tennessee's requirements compare to other states in terms of kind of best practices, but that's what I'm always looking for. Where are programs run well in terms of use of the monies, and the monies are being used in a way that really moves people up to better places economically? You know, where they run well? Because I've concluded that Tennessee does not run its programs well. And one of the problems has to be, a lot of the problems have to be the programmatic problems. So I'd like to hear your input on that.
Yeah, I can take this one. So talking about the eligibility, based on what I've seen, I didn't do like a 50-state survey, but I did some of a couple states down here. Tennessee the eligibility is pretty standard for what other states are, especially from Georgia and other states around. It's really in the enforcement of the program eligibility requirements that may differ per state. So I didn't really speak a ton on it, and it's going to be detailed in our memo, but Tennessee requires what's called a PRP, which is a personal responsibility program. And that requires all applicants to basically, you know, have a job, make sure kids are going to school, have their kids up to date with their immunizations. And depending on how strict the compliance is for that, people can fall off if they don't meet one of the eligibility. I don't know if other states are as strict as Tennessee is, but it's fairly standard across the board of what they require of people. I think also another big issue about TANF is because of its temporary nature, a lot of people phase out of TANF, not because they have been, you know, economically lifted by the program, but because their time in the program has essentially run out. So you can, you know, receive all the benefit that you can receive, and then, you know, at the end, you're just no longer eligible because you've, you know, met the requirements of how long you can receive it, and then you just kind of are phased out. And that's kind of the same idea as I showed in Georgia, where for cash assistance, you're only allowed to get cash assistance for 48 months. Tennessee doesn't really have that requirement. I think it's program specific, but you know, that's sometimes how it happens.
I think Jerry was next.
Yeah, boy, I sit here and listen to this and I get the same reaction I do every time we have a meeting of the Affordable Housing Committee. And we talk about what's not being done and where it's getting stopped and where the dams are in the stream and all that. You just get so angry. And it all gets down to who the power people are. Have we identified them? Because either they're going to have to change their philosophy. Joy, you said it well. It's what's important to them politically. And it's pretty obvious what is and what isn't in our state, has been for some time. So who are the players? Are they the obvious ones? You know, the governor, key senators, congressmen, and certainly the new administrator of the program. But did you learn anything through this about who's got their hand around the pipe and squeezing it shut?
I would say I didn't come across anything publicly available that was super obvious about that. The references to the control over TANF funds are always to DHS and the commissioner. And then there's a TANF task force at the Tennessee legislature. And my intuition is that the legislature has a lot of influence over what happens with the funds, even if no legislative approval is actually required to spend them. They're just influential figures in the state government. But
is that committee in the legislature, is that an active committee? They meet all the time?
I don't know exactly what they've done lately, because when the commissioner's report was released, I think this was 2019 and early 2020, it was released to an active commission at the time, but there have been no updates since that. So I can't really speak to what's going on right now.
I just want to add that it doesn't always appear as if members of the state legislature really know what's going on with that money. I've read quite a few articles where they've interviewed members of the legislature, and they're always shocked that there's so much money in reserve. There was, I think, an audit or a budget interview of former Commissioner Danielle Barnes, and she claimed that many of the 2Gen programs were funded fully through federal dollars, but she later had to retract that statement because, in fact, only a third have been funded through federal money. So even she wasn't really clear on how the money was being spent. So that's why I personally really recommend maybe looking into speaking to the new commissioner, as he was the former head of the federal program. He might have a better idea of what Tennessee could be doing with that money.
Thank you.
Susie had her hand up.
I did want to ask a question, but Jerry kind of covered it. I just was curious to know why, if the legislature doesn't have authority, why do they have authority? But I think that's kind of been answered. So go ahead, Paulette.
I have another question, and it's related to the amount of, or the average wage, since work is a requirement of TANF, and they're only making on average $888.71 a month. And with the monthly cash grant of $244, that's about $1,122, which is not very much to sustain anybody. And that's not even, let's see, that's not even $10 an hour. So I'm trying to understand what the rationale is. I understand, wait a minute. There seems to be a heavy moral underpinning of TANF. You got to be married, you got to work, you got to not, all of those other kinds of things. But there doesn't seem to be, that I can detect based on the knowledge I have and the important information that you've given, any specific orientation to economic stabilization of the families. And I don't know what you found out in that regard.
A quick sentence on when TANF was passed in the 90s, there was a big concern about, there was this big debate with welfare reform over whether providing lots of government benefits was going to foster reliance on government benefits and disincentivize people to work. So I think that's one reason that we see sort of lower benefits and these stringent requirements about you got to work, or you have to have a plan that will show us that you're going to work, because the fear when they passed that, or the bargaining chip was, how do we make sure that people aren't reliant on government funds over the long term? But yes, I think we all agree that the benefits themselves are inadequate and probably haven't achieved a good balance between incentivizing people to work and providing them with a living wage. I don't know if that answers your question. Maybe somebody can add to that.
Oh, I just want to completely echo what Joey said. It almost stems back to, as you said, like a moral undertaking or a moral base of TANF, especially in its temporary nature. It was, quote unquote, never supposed to be a program that assisted people long term. And as you see that and you can see that in the monthly benefits per family. This is just an average, obviously, but as you can see with even the emergency cash assistance, when you increase the number of people in families, it increases marginally. And it wasn't designed to be something that people relied on. It was designed to be something that people got for an interim period of time and then, economically aged out of.
You said there wasn't a time requirement. I know there was 48 months in Georgia. What's the range of time in the program? Because I heard you say that people kind of time out, not that they've achieved any kind of level of economic security.
I believe it's 60 months for Tennessee. Each program has something a little bit different, but I believe it's 60 months.
That's also the federal maximum as well.
I'm sorry?
Yeah.
60 months is also the federal maximum. So some states are allow people to have the funds for a smaller amount of time, but Tennessee does the federal maximum.
I will say too, just to put a fine point on it, the lifetime limit that I mentioned for Georgia was for cash assistance and emergency cash assistance only. I cannot remember right now off the top of my head if other programs differed, but that's an important detail.
Mike and then Jerry.
Yeah, thanks. There was one part in the slides that I got a little confused on, and I think it was in emergency cash assistance. You listed states where payments were made to people that were on TANF, states that made payments to people that were not receiving TANF, and then there was Tennessee and Pennsylvania were giving money regardless of whether they were enrolled in TANF or not. That seemed the same thing as the second category. You had three categories there, and I'm sure I just wasn't picking up the difference. But since Tennessee was in that third category, I wanted to make sure I understood it. There you go.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so it is a little bit confusing. I specified a little bit more in the memo, but probably didn't say it out loud. But those differences are people who are currently enrolled, and then people who are eligible, and then people who meet the requirements that they set out within the specific program. So they're all pretty much, how do I say it? It's all the same requirements. It's just the avenue and by which you are eligible. So the first, the provided temporary payments only to families already receiving TANF assistance. So these are people who are in TANF, in the programs already, have already gone through the process of applying and being part of it. The families not already receiving TANF assistance is people who meet those requirements but haven't actually gone through to become part of the program. So they use the same eligibility requirements for TANF, but it's a separate program of, okay, all of these people in this group would be eligible for our TANF programs, but they haven't actually, gone in to apply. So we're gonna give it to this lot of people. Tennessee and Pennsylvania with their temporary programs, whether you're already enrolled in TANF or not, is that they created a program that's funded by TANF dollars, but not necessarily within those programs. So for Tennessee, they had an emergency cash assistance program that was just separate from all other Families First and everything else. And it was funded by TANF, but not necessarily within Families First. So it was just a program that, you know, the government, it was basically a pop-up program for the pandemic. And people were able to apply. And if they met those requirements during the pop-up program, then they would get the emergency assistance. And that was until about, I think they extended it to the end of August of 2020.
Were any of those payments targeted at like eviction prevention?
So it wasn't specific for housing. It was purely just an emergency cash assistance for those who want to apply and need the money. So it was basically a block payment to the family. So they got, depending on your household, you got from $500 to $1,000 over a 2-month period.
Thank you.
Jerry?
Just keeping in mind, you know, you always want to jump to, okay, what do we do now? And to try to kind of start doing this, hey, we need to realize that that T means temporary. And so we shouldn't try to make this another welfare program, because I think we would alienate the people in power whom we need to work with to get this thing corrected. So keep our mind on the fact that it ought to be temporary, but then broaden access to it, make it easier to apply, easier to qualify, and then try to increase the amount of money. I mean, an extra $200 to somebody making $888 is just ridiculous. And anyway, I'm just throwing that out, kind of what I'm thinking, to see if anybody else, am I on the right track?
Well, the thoughts I've had, and I agree completely with our wonderful team, is that it's critical to talk with Clarence Carter, the new commissioner. I think it's also, and also to learn more, maybe have a broader perspective on what's going on nationally, but I think it's important to do some kind of, maybe several power one-on-ones with him and read whatever we can find about his orientation. I think the second part is to the task force on TANF that exists at the legislature. I don't, if it's a task force or if it's a commission or whatever, I think we need to find out more about that and do one-on-ones with those members. And the thing I haven't quite figured out is, since the legislature does not have to approve the spending, I'm not sure who we need to advocate with or put pressure on to do some different kinds of things. It seemed as if there was a Department of Finance and Administration has a lot to do with that, and I would imagine the governor as well, but that's the thing I'm a little bit unclear about.
Maggie?
Well, I'm speaking from past experience and present as well. I helped Kay and Steve Bennett draft the letter that we said last week at our meeting that we wanted to send to the commissioner. And not only does he have that federal experience, but he actually set up a nonprofit to help families in some of these exact same ways. And then helped administer it. And so in the letter that we put together, we've referenced both his federal experience and his personal interest in that way. But I agree with you that actually talking to him would be helpful. And the other thing I would say is that, having been there and seen it happen, when there's a program that doesn't require the state legislature's approval, the governor can make a big change. I went from one administration to another where almost overnight, the federal and state programs that I managed, the way they were administered changed. And I know that you know, this governor's a little timid in some ways, but he certainly has the power. It seemed to me that the commissioner's maybe the leverage point, though.
It seems to me that continued attention to this and in the way of publicity of how these things are going, and educating ourselves, the legislators, I don't know, not the commissioner, but the public would be helpful to holding this up as a important issue.
I think Paulette's right on the money too. The first person we ought to become real good friends with is Clarence Carter, because with that experience and background and his current position, he's more likely to know and to help us target our efforts in the best way possible.
Okay.
And I'll just put this out there. I don't know what the timing of this all will be. And my students are graduating in mid-April, but depending on what the timing of this is, Vanderbilt could potentially provide some support if you wanted to make a presentation.
Well, we'll just have to hang around a little bit longer. That's all there is to it.
Can't graduate, sorry. But definitely, I think, keep us posted on what NOAA decides to do, I think, going forward.
Well, the way you put this presentation together has been really, really so impactful, so easy to understand, and with so much clarity. You really, I know that you know much more than what you've provided us, but the way you provided us with what you know has been really exemplary.
Very helpful, very.
And I also want to just thank you for taking time in the last semester of 3L to take on something like this. And also, Jennifer, I'm not sure what your role, I know you're the professor, but I don't know if it's like for clinical or what, but I appreciate that you connected us, because very often we're volunteers, and even though we may have degrees and stuff like that, we don't have the intentionally focused time to devote. And I truly appreciate Joey and Shannon and Alyssa and Wendy, and I'm gonna have to sign off. Thank you.
Bye, Paulette.
Yeah, and Jennifer, thanks, and thanks to all of you students. We're looking forward to that report, and maybe a few of these questions that we've raised today answered. That would be wonderful. And if we can continue to work before you leave, if you all have the time, I'm sure that would be helpful. So Jennifer, you and I can continue the conversation, and Jerry, and
Absolutely.
We'll see where to go from here. But many, many thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
And I just want to say, if you think of questions that we need to ask Clarence Carter, and you don't see you again, please get Jennifer to let us know. Like, I want to know what did they do in 2020?
Hello. Hello.
Good.
That's
Okay.
it. That's it.
Oh, I'm in a Zoom meeting. Let me call you back.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks all. Bye.
Brilliant.
Bye.
Good
Yeah.
work.
Thank you, everyone.